Hello and welcome back, watch lovers. Breitling is a brand synonymous with flight and aircraft, and this association can trace its roots back to the 1930s. But how did this brand become so respected by pilots during the past? And what was the innovative feature that they engineered onto their watches that changed pilots' lives forever? In this video, we're going to answer this question and find out how Breitling conquered the skies. Breitling was founded in 1884 by Leon Breitling. Originally from Germany, he emigrated to Switzerland with his parents, who were in search of work. Leon himself found work as an apprentice watchmaker and quickly found out that he'd had an aptitude in this field. So at the age of 24, he founded his own namesake watchmaking company in the Jura Mountains of Switzerland. The field of watches that he steered his company towards making was for pocket chronographs. In the late 19th century, watches had not yet evolved to be worn on the wrist, but instead were carried in the pocket. Chronographs were increasing in demand from the fields of science, sports and military, but required the finest craftsmen and materials to produce them for their accuracy. The company quickly made a name for themselves, producing reliable, innovative timepieces that they had to move to a larger premises just a few years later. In 1915, Leon's son Gaston inherited the company, and under his leadership, Breitling released one of the world's first wrist-worn chronographs. This watch had a new innovation at the time, which was a separate push button from the crown used for controlling the start and stop function. The reset mechanism was integrated into the crown itself. In 1932, Willie Breitling took over as leader of the company. He was the founder Leon's grandson, and although he was a relatively young man at only 19 years of age, the company would continue to grow for the next 42 years under his leadership. Willie was no slouch when it came to innovations either. In fact, one of his patents that he filed in 1934 can be found on modern-day chronographs across all brands. That feature is adding a second push button for resetting the chronograph. The beginnings of Breitling's association with the aviation industry came in 1936 when they introduced a chronograph especially made for aviators with a black dial and luminescent hands and numerals. The success of this watch spurred on Breitling to create a division for making onboard clocks and other dashboard instruments for aircraft. They call this division the Wheat Aviation Department, wheat being the French word for the number 8, which referred to the amazing 8-day power reserves of the mechanical instruments that they were producing at the time. Just a few years after Wheat Aviation Department's formation, World War II had started. This meant that there was an increase in demand for their products, and they even won a contract with the British Royal Air Force. Breitling's chronographs were fitted on board Lancaster bombers and even Spitfire planes. (1940) now, and Breitling released the Chronomat. Named Chronomat, the word was a portmanteau combining the words chronograph and mathematics. It was aimed at scientists and mathematicians because it had a slide rule built into the rotating bezel that could be used for calculations. These were the days before electronic calculators, and logarithmic scales were relied upon for maths functions. Breitling were granted a patent for this ingenious feature, and they expanded their growth in supplying equipment to professional clientele, which now included the American Armed Forces. So although the Chronomat was made for scientists and engineers, pilots had to make do with an analog computing device called an E6B to make calculations relating to aviation. This was a flat circular slide rule, usually made of cardboard or metal, used during flight planning to aid in calculating fuel burn, wind correction, time en route, and other items. Knowing about the Chronomat watch, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, or AOPA, approached Breitling to develop a watch for them capable of doing some of the calculations that the E6B computer could do, but built into a watch. After some time in development, Breitling delivered in 1952 the watch that the AOPA had been asking for. This watch was the Breitling Navitimer. The word Navitimer was again a portmanteau made up of the words navigation and timer. It quickly became a favorite amongst pilots and was the official watch of the AOPA, whose winged logo is featured on the watch. The watch could be used for all airborne navigation calculations, such as climbing times, fuel consumption rate, and even used to convert miles to kilometers. With the Navitimer being used by pilots in the skies around the world, there was only one further destination the watch could go to next, and that was space. It's the early 1960s and the space race was just warming up. Only a handful of people had ever left Earth's orbit up until this point, and Scott Carpenter was about to become one of them. Carpenter was preparing for his upcoming flight on board the Mercury Atlas VII on 24th of May 1962. He was a pilot for the US Navy and had become familiar with the Navitimer during the Korean War. Carpenter's responsibility for the space mission was for the onboard navigational equipment. He wanted to use the Navitimer for the mission, but he also wanted some changes made to it to make it suitable for space travel. Breitling were asked to modify the watch to give it a bigger bezel so that it could be used with thick gloves, the removal of the tachymeter scale to make it more legible, and for the hour markings and mechanism to be in a 24-hour format so that he knew whether it was night or day back at base. This modified version of the Navitimer was used by Carpenter on the mission and completed 3 orbits off the Earth. The watch didn't survive the landing back on Earth, however, as it was never designed to be waterproof and was submerged in the sea upon re-entry. However, this didn't stop Breitling from marketing a civilian version of the watch, and it was renamed the Cosmonaut. During the 1960s to the 1970s, Breitling continued their growth of the supply of aeroplane chronographs and instruments to include commercial airlines. Their products could now be found on board planes made by manufacturers such as Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, and their onboard instruments became as familiar to pilots as their wristwatches. Despite this, the Swiss watch market suffered an overall sales decline during the 1960s, and so Breitling had to come up with something to inject new life into their wristwatches. Automatic watches were gaining in popularity in comparison to manual wind watches, and so the race was on to develop the world's first automatic chronograph. Breitling formed a consortium with other watchmakers, including rival Hoyer, to develop the world's first automatic chronograph movement. Their joint venture was dubbed Project 99, and they knew that they were in a race against time, as other rivals Zenith and Seiko were also trying to develop the movement. At the April 1969 Basel Fair, Breitling announced the results of their labour with a new line of automatic chronographs they called the Chronomatic. It had a striking design with the crown being on the left side of the case and was a major technological breakthrough for the entire Swiss watch industry. Sales picked up, but the Swiss watch industry was coming up against some fierce competition, as we shall see next. That competition came in the form of the Quartz Revolution. In the early 1970s, Seiko released the world's first quartz movement. It was highly accurate, and although quartz watches were expensive at first, prices soon plummeted and were gaining popularity amongst the watch buying public. Many Swiss watch manufacturers did not choose to become a part of this so-called Quartz Revolution, sticking to only making luxury mechanical watches, and went out of business. Breitling was not one of them and did choose to make the quartz movement a part of their lineup and brought out quartz versions of their Chronomat and Navitimer watches. It's 1979 now, and Willie Breitling, who had been in charge since 1932, is in ill health. He sells the company to Ernest Schneider, who was a pilot and watchmaker with a background in electronics. Schneider would remain in charge until 2017. During his time at the company, Schneider revived the company to its former glory days by redeveloping existing models and introducing some new ones. One notable model is the Emergency. First introduced in 1995, the Emergency became the first wristwatch with the potential to save lives, thanks to a built-in emergency transmitter locked onto the International Air Distress Frequency. Another notable model is the Aerospace. Crafted in titanium, it was a success with pilots when first released. I consider this watch to be the modern-day spiritual successor to the Navitimer. Today, Breitling is owned by the British private equity firm CVC Partners, who have been the owners since 2017. They continue to make watches true to the brand's motto of instruments for professionals. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already done so. Leave a like and comment if you like Breitling watches or if you don't. I'm going to leave you now with some pictures of some nice watches in their current lineup. See you next time.